Hey, this is just a quick note about our sponsor, Privado, the premier enterprise privacy platform, purpose-built to bridge the gap between privacy and engineering. Its privacy code scanning solution embeds privacy compliance and governance into the product development lifecycle and empowers privacy and security teams with unparalleled visibility of sensitive data flows and the insights to find and fix privacy vulnerabilities. You can leverage Privado's data flows, dynamic data mapping, privacy assessment automation, and real-time visibility of privacy issues. Enter the era of proactive privacy and transform privacy from business blocker to business enabler. To learn more, go to privado.ai. Hello, I am Deborah J. Farber. Welcome to the Shifting Privacy Left podcast, where we talk about embedding privacy by design and default into the engineering function to prevent privacy harms to humans and to prevent dystopia. Each week, we'll bring you unique discussions with global privacy technologists and innovators working at the bleeding edge of privacy research and emerging technologies, standards, business models, and ecosystems. Today, I'm delighted to welcome my next guest, Markus Lampinen, CEO of Prifina, a personal data platform where the data is owned by individuals themselves and anyone can build privacy-preserving services for people to live happier and healthier lives. Today, we're going to be discussing meaty topics like how to build privacy-respective apps for consumer wearable sensors, large language models like ChatGPT, and why we should consider training our own personal AIs. Welcome, Markus.
Thank you, Deborah. It's awesome to be here. That sounds like a fantastic list we've got for the agenda.
Yeah, I think it's pretty topical right now. And I love that you've been working on some of these overlapping challenges that are kind of coming to the foray around AI, but also privacy. And before we get into some of those meaty topics, I'd really love to kick off the conversation by first understanding how you got into privacy and then co-founded a privacy tech company like Prifina. Can you tell us your origin story?
No, 100%. Maybe first and foremost for everybody listening, I'm very much a data geek. I mean, I'm the biggest data nerd that you'll find. So for me, it's really been kind of this realization that I've been tracking my own eating, my own activity, my own sleep, stress levels for a long time now. And one of the things that we realized was that with the increasing amounts of data that we have, it's also brought in this liability aspect of it. So when I started thinking about the future that, okay, it feels like privacy is it's increasing the liability of utilizing data. And as a result, a lot of companies are actually using less data, especially data that they don't understand or control or feel comfortable with. But then at the same time, that feels to be very much in contrast to where we need to go. Like if we think about what type of services and apps and, things we want to have in 10 years, 20 years, I mean, it seems obvious to me that we're going to need to use orders of magnitudes or just ridiculous amounts of more data than what we do right now. So that's where essentially we kind of got into looking at, okay, how do we navigate this? Like, how can we actually use a lot more data by then, in a way at the same time completely preserving privacy. And I think a lot of what we started doing at Prifina was really just driven by that notion that we actually utilize data ourselves a lot, but we've been utilizing it with very poor tools. Like you've been using, for example, spreadsheets to track different types of activity and correlate those yourself. And this is where we kind of wanted to tap into that, okay, how can we give individuals just a better ability to utilize this data? But then also utilize it in a way that it actually has a meaningful impact because, you can track data and feed your OCD as much as you want. But if you actually want to do something, then you have to have very, very clear uses of that. And that's where we started kind of building this company around that. What are the very, very clear things that you can do with your data yourself so that you can actually improve something, such as, for example, the way that you sleep, the amount of deep sleep that you get. So that's very much me as a data geek coming into this. And privacy is absolutely key. But I would frame essentially a lot of what we've been doing that the ability to use more data in the future, it hinges on, this very fundamental way that you have to respect privacy and you have to have privacy embedded at the get-go. Otherwise, especially with sensitive data sets like what we're talking about today, personal data, wearable data, sensors, and different things like these, unless you have privacy embedded at the get-go, you're just not going to be able to use that in a meaningful way going forward.
So one of the things that I love about Prifina is that you have a really clear focus on a particular industry set of privacy and development challenges. So in this case, that's helping IoT companies, particularly those who provide wearable sensors, used to be called kind of the quantified self of movement, but I'm not hearing people refer to it as much in that way anymore. But you're bringing to market privacy, the enablement of privacy respective apps. So would you mind describing like the approach you took with building Prifina here and maybe flesh out some of the use cases to illustrate the problem you're solving for?
Yeah. So if you start thinking about this very, very basic premise that you're right, quantified self and the biohacking and all of that, that's been around for a long time. But in the last 5 years or so, we started having all sorts of different wearable sensors, personal sensors, wearable devices, whatnot, that generate a lot of data. And this data is actually, because it's measured from our bodies, then it is very, very, it's very sensitive. And it's also, if you start imagining that companies start collecting this, it also brings about a number of different types of issues. Like if you have a ride-sharing company tracking, for example, the driver's sleep, then, yes, hypothetically, you can make safer rides, but at the same time, why is a ride-share company tracking where and how their drivers sleep? So part of what we started solving for was really that how do we get more utility out of this data? And it really started with this concept of individual ownership, that who should actually benefit from this data that we generate? And in our view, it should be us. It should be individuals themselves. And then if individuals gain value by sharing some parts of that with companies, then fantastic, 100% go for it. But if you start thinking about, for example, the type of data that we have, like I'm wearing an Oura ring and I'm wearing an Apple Watch, and I also have a smart scale in my bedroom. So if you start thinking about, okay, what can I do with these? Right now, all of the data is in different types of silos. It's in different companies' own servers. But what I can do with Prifina is I can collect this data from the smart scale, from the smart ring, from the smart watch, and I can bring it into my own Prifina account. Now, what that then enables me to do is just run very simple applications on top of this. An example would be that the wearables that I wear, like the Oura Ring and the Apple Watch, they both measure my deep sleep. So what the scale does, it actually measures temperature and humidity and things like these, which wouldn't be completely evident, but if you look at the data that it actually does capture, then it does have those. So you can very quickly create a hypothesis that, okay, what temperature should your bedroom be at so that you can maximize deep sleep? Or maybe your goal is to maximize REM sleep. I don't know. But in a way, by combining those, then you can create a sleep optimizer app. So that's a very, very simple example. But I really like this one because it takes different data points that we already have and it creates a new utility out of them that we didn't have. And the reality is that for a lot of data sources and companies that are out there, then, for example, the smart rings, they typically are designed to help you optimize your sleep. But they are tracking so many different types of things. And those data points, they could be utilized also for other types of applications. Like, for example, most of them, they track your skin temperature. So if you're able to do something like that, and you could look at, okay, what is the temperature change? Then you could, for example, create different types of preventative health applications, even based on just that very, very simple alert that when something feels off with your temperature. So really what we're trying to do is we're trying to do a twofold shift. One is that you as an individual, you can collect all your data and you can use it yourself to your own benefit, like, for example, optimizing your deep sleep. But the second is that we also want to empower different companies, developers, to build those types of applications that take different combinations of data that the individuals might have and essentially repurpose it in a new type of application. This includes, of course, also those that manufacture the personal sensors, like the wearables, for example. They can use our framework. Anybody can. It's an open framework. But that being said, then a lot of that value prop is really around this benefit that if you can separate the actual application from the data, then you're making the data portable. And then we as individuals, we can decide that, okay, what do we want to power with this data? And in our framework, you can use these types of applications and services that are built without actually sharing any data. So you can think about it as, I love this analogy of bring your own beer to bring your own data. So in a way, what you're doing is you have the data, but the application is coming to you instead of you actually going, outside of your own domain, so to speak, with your data. So that's kind of the starting point. But we really do see that in the longer term, that we can create this type of ecosystem around the individuals themselves, where individuals themselves, they can use the data that they've already got in a simpler way to power different things that have positive outcomes for their own benefit. And this is where we also seen a lot of, what should I call it? A lot of innovation from the community, because once you do get the data out and you do get it to flow, then you can do things that just haven't been possible before. And sometimes it's very mundane, like, for example, optimizing deep sleep is very important, but, for argument's sake, let's call it mundane. But then at the same time, some of those developer led applications are also fascinating. Like, for example, can you optimize a Spotify playlist based on your stress levels? If you want to create a stress reducing Spotify playlist, can you actually quantify that? Can you actually, based on data, create one that would essentially achieve that goal? So that's what we're doing, that really looking at how do we ourselves gain benefit from our own data.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Hello, loyal listeners. The Shifting Privacy Left podcast is seeking sponsors who want to help educate our growing community of privacy engineers. Position your brand in front of privacy engineers, architects, developers, researchers, and privacy tech buyers. Insert a 30 to 60 second ad like this one into every published episode of the podcast. This is dynamic content after all. Feature your new product, an upcoming conference, a sponsored special deal, endless opportunities. Email sponsorship@shiftingprivacyleft.com for more information on our sponsorship package. Okay, let's get back to our engaging privacy conversation. I think it's so exciting. And as privacy experts, people like myself get a little siloed into the work we're doing, and maybe not, that doesn't have to do with like developing actual apps or architecting anything. So from what I've learned from you, I understand that you've got quite a large community of people who are innovating and playing around with what they can do with Prifina, correct? Like, how large is your community right now?
Yeah, it's fascinating. And that's probably one of the most exciting things that we're seeing, that we've had over 30,000 developers interact with us and build and test and prototype various different types of things. And these are oftentimes, similar type of data geeks to me, that once you actually have access to data and you can build different types of things, then, there's no shortage of different ideas. That's really an exciting thing to see, that people innovating new types of ways of utilizing data in an individual first fashion. And the fact that it's individual first, that's embedded into the platform itself. And it is, to be fair, one of the things why many developers and companies are drawn to us, that this notion of individuals owning and being essentially the point of, the decider of what happens with their data. That's a huge thing. And then, to a certain extent, it's also that there are many companies out there that really like the idea of utilizing data for some type of application or service, but several of them, and an increasing amount, don't actually want to keep the data. Because if you start collecting, for example, things like sensitive data on heart rates of individuals, then that can actually bring out a lot more issues that you need to manage down the line. But that community it's a fascinating driver. And what we've been doing now recently is getting more into the hardware side of things as well with sensors, where effectively what we can do is it's not just the data that we have, but it's the data that we could have. So then essentially you get into a different audience where it's not just software developers or data scientists, but it's different types of folks that they might have, let's say, an idea to take a certain type of sensor and place it into, I don't know, like the heel of their shoe or their, endurance bike or whatnot. And then once you're able to do that, then you can actually create something quite novel. And the fun thing is that this is actually all relatively simple to do nowadays. You get the entire data infrastructure from Prifina. Individuals control it. Nobody has access to the data, not Google, Facebook, not us as Prifina, just the individual. But then after that, for example, taking a sensor off the shelf, I mean, you can get a sensor with like, 10, 20 bucks. And most of them, there's so many different types of sensors. So you just place it, connect it, and then you've got a sensorized device. And this is something that we're starting to dabble with a lot more, that how can we connect more of the different things that we kind of interface with, and then kind of almost build this type of ecosystem of connected devices as well as different data sources around ourselves, hopefully in a healthier way than what's going on, for example, with the Roombas of the world that we don't necessarily exert the most control over. So that community is really important to us. And I think that community is also something that we're looking at as the builders of the future. That when we get new types of applications, new types of values that individuals benefit from, if companies and developers can build those from the get-go with privacy controls embedded, then that's probably the most exciting thing for us, because in many, many regards, that community is really leading the way in terms of where that utility comes from and what type of data sets we've looked at, but also continue to support going forward.
Yeah, so that, it's almost like what you've done is you've built constraints into your platform that, provide guardrails to the developers, because that way they don't have to know all the nuances and details of privacy and security, kind of just build that into the so that they don't have to think about those things. You just kind of instead provide them with choices, which I think, choices with how do you want to architect stuff. So I think it's really meeting the developers' needs where they're at and just kind of removing that heavy lifting, removing that obstacle for them that they would otherwise look at privacy as a barrier to their innovation, simply because they just aren't aware of what it is they need to do. And therefore trying to understand all the requirements is that barrier, as opposed to, something like Prifina providing almost, I don't want to say a safe sandbox, because it's not a sandbox, obviously, but it's a, you've architected it so that they don't have to think about.
And it's a really, really fair way of thinking about it, because if you think about a lot of the work that privacy professionals do, then a lot of it is after the fact. Like, you've built something, you start to get users, you start to get lots of data, and then you're like, oh crap, I'm sitting on this huge entire hive of valuable, sensitive data. What do I do now? And a lot of what we wanted to do was really kind of avoid those uh-oh moments. That if you get data and you can build applications that generate, utility for individuals, and individuals pay for that utility or your service or whatever you're doing, once you get to that point that you actually start having a lot of users and a lot of data, if you architected it right from the start, then you don't have that uh-oh moment. Building a company, you have many different uh-oh moments, but at least the data shouldn't become that type of a time bomb or hot potato. And one thing that we've noticed is that, in a way, nobody really thinks about privacy at the start. It's not front of mind for anybody.
It is for me.
And I think it's something that a lot of people, they really do start with absolutely fantastic intentions. Like, they start thinking about, okay, I've got individuals that I can help sleep better. And that's it. Like, the driver is, I want to help them sleep better. And then after that, they start achieving that. And then, once they've got to a certain stage, they get to that uh-oh moment. But if we solve that uh-oh moment at the get-go, so that they don't actually end up holding the hot potato, that there is no hot potato, then, they might realize it only later. They might actually realize the value only later, that, hey, actually, it's pretty cool that our individual customers own this data that's helping them sleep better. But that's where I really like that notion that they come for the data, they come for essentially building out those individually centered outcomes. And then they realize later on, step by step that, hey, actually, the architecture that I utilize is pretty cool. But it is oftentimes that type of process where, depending on the choices that you make on day one, then in day 180, 360, whatever, you end up in this type of position where you're like, okay, what has to happen now? And oftentimes it is an after the fact type of realization that, hey, the choice that I made a year ago, they're now forcing me to do X, Y, and Z. And this is I kind of think about it in that way, that the companies that do join us, then many of them realize that from the start. Many of them realize it on maybe a conceptual level, but they don't really learn what it actually means in like a technical sense until later on. But I think it's a very, very empowering thing where you see that they've actually got individuals gaining value from what they're doing, for example, sleeping better. And at the same time, you can kind of tell this story to the individual that it is really you utilizing your data. It's really your data working for you, as opposed to somebody else, gathering your data and then essentially, utilizing it for you. So I think it's also an interesting shift where you're absolutely right that there are some of those defaults that are set into the platform, like everything is private. And that, if you did choose to share something, then you would have to authorize that. And you're never sharing all of your data. You're sharing, only certain snippets and so on and so forth. But at the same time, that is something that they buy into at the start. And that then avoids that type of uh-oh moment then down the line, whenever that uh-oh moment would come.
That's such a comprehensive answer. And you're really describing things in a way that's really tangible here, I think, for people to learn. I think these are all in and of itself could be separate topics that we could have entire podcast interview about. I want to unpack, for instance, the data portability aspect, because very few people even talk about enabling portability of data. It's kind of like, oh, maybe one day we'll enable you to re-download all the data we took from you and through DSARs and such, right? When you make an access request, but only under those conditions. But one day we'll allow you to make it portable to anywhere else if there's a standard or something. But what it looks like here is that you are standardizing it. I mean, I don't want to say that in terms of like an actual standard, but you are creating a repeatable way in which these companies that leverage sensor data can enable portability of personal data on an individual level. And so I think honestly, it's kind of a breakthrough.
And I think it's also one of these things that, if you think about, for example, portability as it exists now, or even the data access requests, they're very, very clunky. There is no such thing that you pull your data from one thing and you plug it into another. Like, that doesn't exist. And I don't know if it will exist for some time to come. Because right now what's happening is that, you want to get your data from something and then you're typically downloading a CSV or some big archive or something. And who knows what to do with that? I mean, I can open up tables on my desktop, but then, I'm looking at tables of data and how does that benefit me? Creates a new headache for me. But in a way, in all simplicity, I mean, you don't have to kind of, as a company or as a developer, you don't have to marry our model. But if you support our model, then that means that you could create your own app, your own iOS app, but you could also create a Prifina iOS app. And what that then means is that your individual customer, they can choose then, do they use the one where all their data is with you, or do they also use the one where all their data is with themselves? And this is what I see as, even though we're not GDPR or CCPA compliance company by any means, then in a way, what we're doing is you can allow the individual just to access and utilize their data and keep it with them. But portability to us also means that you should be able to leave us too. And the way that we've solved this is that what we're doing in the background is we're creating your own personal cloud environment where at the start, when you start using Prifina, then, we're providing it as a free thing for you until certain type of limits, because if you start bringing in all of your data, then obviously we're not a data storage company. But that said, if at some point you said that, hey, Markus, this was a great idea, but I'd really like essentially to sever this and just keep my data myself on my own hard drive, then what happens is you effectively just put your own credit card details into your own cloud environment. And then after that, you're just managing it yourself. Now, this would be the extreme case of data portability. And I would imagine that in our case, it's mainly, for example, software developers that don't like essentially us managing, or they, prefer to manage everything themselves, like all the nitty gritty stuff of their cloud environment, then they can do that. But the data portability is fundamental. And I think if I were to make a guess in terms of how that goes in the industry overall, is that most likely it will be solved by something similar to what we're building. Hopefully we are part of solving it as well. But I'm quite skeptical about these solutions when you're downloading data and then plugging it somewhere else, because they're just, you're putting a lot of burden on the individual. And I think for individuals to actually be able to take actionable control and generate utility out of their data, it has to be consumer grade. And this is one of those things that we actually talk about a lot internally at Prifina, that most people aren't data geeks like I am. And most people haven't spent a lot of time thinking about all the data that they've got. So for this to actually become something where they want to use it and they want to power apps where they keep their data, it has to be consumer grade. And portability is one part of it, but right now portability is nowhere near consumer grade, but I would argue it's not even at the level that's even usable.
I agree. It is definitely not usable. And it's kind of one of the dark secrets of data protection. So, you've been talking about how, it's not enough to have just on the data compliance solutions that are out there. That's exactly why I invited you onto the show, to talk about shifting left and some ways to architect for developers. And so we just want to underscore the shifting left trend. And I think that is what's going to kind of push this industry forward, is just more entrepreneurs kind of creating developer resources that make what they're trying to do easy and privacy respective. Okay, so I want to turn to a really hot topic right now: large language models, or LLMs, like OpenAI's ChatGPT. There are many others. Google's got one called BERT, and there's many others in development, although OpenAI's published ChatGPT, which is their prototype artificial intelligence chatbot, and it's earned them an enormous popularity among the general public. And just for those who don't know, GPT stands for Generative Pre-trained Transformer. And GPT-3, which is different from ChatGPT, is the largest language model known at the time, with 175 billion parameters trained on 570 gigabytes of text. LLMs like ChatGPT are able to respond to questions in a human-like manner and in a great detail. I'm sure many of you are seeing, people posting examples of what they've, from the queries that they've asked ChatGPT. And LLMs can be defined as a deep learning algorithm that can recognize, summarize, translate, predict, and generate text and other content based on knowledge gained from massive data sets. Not only does ChatGPT provide users with links to browse through, but it also solves complex problems and provides nuanced answers to inquiries. And many believe that LLMs might actually have the potential to completely transform the way in which we use search engines. So I've even heard people state that they feel, Google might have an existential crisis about whether or not they'll have competition for search. So now that I've given that background, can you outline for us, is it about LLMs that has technologists so excited?
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic background to give. And as you were talking, I was thinking about the ChatGPT in particular, because that's been, that's boomed in the last month or so. I would also argue that we're probably at least at the top of the first wave of the hype cycle, that we're now essentially shifting a lot of the attention away from just ChatGPT to other generative AI solutions, which is great because there are a number of other ones like you also mentioned. Maybe the way that I would think about ChatGPT and this recent wave is maybe it's not so much a technical breakthrough as it is a commercial breakthrough. because in a way, there has been a lot of development in this domain. Like you had what was it? IBM's Watson that won at Jeopardy, like, I don't know, nearly a decade ago now. So there's been a lot of work that's been happening in this domain, but never has it been so visible. And that's really what ChatGPT did. And, OpenAI, they were remarkable in their success of pushing it out and really getting it to the stage that, it's almost like the new coming of the Twitter fail whale, where, it's so popular that everybody's on the site, even though it doesn't work. That's something that I think is really, really remarkable. Now, why is it so appealing? Like, why have people got so excited? I think it's really this first real practical peek into how generative AI could actually have an impact. Like most of the stuff that you get from ChatGPT, it's not groundbreaking yet, to be completely fair. And this is my own personal opinion, and that's something that others could debate. But most of the stuff, because it's trained on a huge language data set, then it's only as good as the data that it was trained on. Like a lot of the stuff that you get, it's generic, it's general, and it's not really utilizable from the get-go. Now, it is also fascinating in terms of what it can do, because it's trained on a large textual data set. Then it means that it can, for example, write sheet music. It can do haikus that rhyme properly. It can do, for example, one of my favorites is asking it to write depressing nursery rhymes and just see what type of creativity, it comes out with. So I think it's really kind of, it's cemented this idea that, it's not necessarily this version of ChatGPT, but it will be one of the ones that does actually create that existential crisis for Google. Because, everything that I said about like the ChatGPT being generic and general and so on and so forth, that's true of search as well, right? So it's not necessarily the end all be all type of solution, but it certainly is a threat to search because it's just a different interface for something similar, a little bit more personal. But I think what we're seeing is really that people are, by and large, maybe for the first time, really getting introduced to what direction we're going in. And that's been an incredible thing to see, because you start seeing different types of use cases, different types of applications, different types of potentials. And all of those, they will then spur even more innovation into those domains. And that's just going to be a fantastic thing to see, because if we can identify where generative AI can play a huge role, that's going to drive a lot more investment into that. And then hopefully we'll also get into those types of positions where we're not getting general comments anymore, but we actually end up with things that are, in fact, usable and actionable from that. Search has been around. Just kind of anchoring on search. Search has been around for a long time. So this is also very interesting to think about, okay, what's the next thing? And maybe generative AI and maybe interacting with, quote unquote search through that type of interface. Maybe that is the next wave that we'll see for that type of a mass application.
Are you able to describe for us the difference between like GPT-3 and ChatGPT? I kind of alluded to the definitions on top, but practically, how does one talk about GPT-3 in a different context from ChatGPT?
Yeah, and this is an area where I'm definitely not an expert here. But ChatGPT, as far as I understand it, it's just a different application layer for essentially the data set. OpenAI has larger language models that it's using. I can't remember exactly which one trains or which one powers ChatGPT, but the biggest thing that they realized was that by giving it a very, very simple interface for humans to utilize, in this case, the chatbot, then that essentially allowed it to not just get stuck with its limitations, but almost enhance them. And what I mean by that is that it's text-based. So, it's going to do really, really well with things that are textual. Like, for example, I mentioned sheet music, which is really, really great. Like, it's not going to paint you a picture. It's not going to give you sheet music, but it's going to give you essentially the codified versions. And it can do rhythm because it's trained on different types of things like this. It can do melody and all of that. So ChatGPT is very much the application. And it's a very, very interesting and obviously very successful choice that they made for actually realizing and releasing it in that type of a domain where essentially the boundaries that it has don't actually end up being visible because everybody knows what a chatbot is. So it's sort of like, the next version of a chatbot. But the actual AI engine that sits beneath it, then that's something that obviously ChatGPT is a prototype. So what type of skins they can put on top of it on their AI engine, I mean, that's going to be massive. It's not just going to be a chatbot. It can be basically anything going forward.
That's important to keep in mind that this is just one step of innovation, iteration, that there's more training, there's more testing and research and use cases being developed, as well as just more training. So there's a lot that we'll need to keep on top of as this technology evolves. And that said, the benefits of LLMs can be enormous. And, as you've been saying, if we follow the happy path where everything works out as intended and all stakeholders are content. But we know that that's a concern. So can you describe for us some of the dangers of using LLMs and especially harms to privacy? But, you could expand beyond that.
Yeah, and that happy path is a fantastic thought. Like, if we only always stayed on that happy path, but that doesn't, there's going to be everything of everything. That's typically what happens. What's happening right now is that people are incredibly excited about ChatGPT and they're using it for everything, which, as a true prototype, you should be. And that's really what OpenAI is benefiting from. At the same time, then we're having a lot of these types of discussions where, for example, take that sheet music example. It's trained on other people's creations, other people's sheet music. So if I, for example, create my depressing nursery rhyme sheet music and it ends up becoming a huge success, which I hope that one doesn't, but let's say it does, then who owns that? Who owns the proceeds from that? Who gets royalties? So there's different things like these that are just not thought through yet, because you have, for example, something that like melodies in the world, there are only so many and they overlap. So what was it trained on and how do you do attribution across those? So some of these things are, maybe not directly privacy concerns, but, they end up becoming very, very important moral concerns that we need to figure out and structure. Have other things too, like you've had a lot of universities and colleges that have to deal with the fact that, students are able to use ChatGPT to create MBA sounding speak, which it seems to be very, very fluent and abundant in. And that's also something that, where did that come from? And how do you deal with the rise of these types of technologies? Arguably, you can make the case that it was similar to search engines previously, or Wikipedia, that, people would pull all sorts of different things from them. But those things have evolved into having attribution and having the right footnotes and having the right disclosures in terms of what we're using overall. I think one concern generally is that as people get more and more excited about the use of ChatGPT, then, OpenAI has been very specific that it's a prototype and it's in beta. But I think people are just feeding so much stuff on that they're almost becoming reliant on it. And the reliance itself isn't necessarily a concern. At least, everybody's free to do what they want. But that said, if essentially the expectation is that you're going to get something that's actually immediately usable, then I just don't think that we're there yet. Just as an example, the example that I would give is that if you take something which is very specific and something that's very important, like, I don't know, somebody asks ChatGPT for weight loss advice or advice on mental health or what have you, if people are under the impression that it's actually an intelligent being of sorts that can answer those questions and not a equivalent to a search engine, then that's a very dangerous fallacy. So I think there's a lot of education that also needs to happen in terms of what it is and what it's not. And it has a lot of potential, absolutely fantastic potential, as does the entire field of generative AI. But here comes a human element that we humans have to also be very conscious of where we are along that cycle, just so that we don't over leverage ourselves. And there's the other thing which relates to what we're doing, that it's based on a large language data set, which is fantastically large, But that being said, it's a general data set. So if you're asking for example, advice on, I don't know, how not to feel so tired, I mean, it's based on generic stuff. So it can come up with 10 different types of things, but at the end of the day, it's your responsibility yourself to make sure that you then take that and you critically take it forward and not just essentially, in the worst case, take something like that, copy paste it and send it on to some other person. And then that other person thinks that, okay, well, this is thought through solid advice, which ChatGPT, for all its intents and purposes, is just not yet. It's suggestions, it's examples, but it is very reliant on the human actually critically evaluating it and then figuring out, what is the utility and what do I do with this?
You make really excellent points. And I do want to call out that where you were suggesting that humans could be very angry or they could be harmed basically psychologically by interacting with a chatbot thinking it was a human, that actually is a harm of decisional interference. If someone is making a decision to, do something based on the conversation they're having, I mean, it could be something like, I don't know, as dire as not to commit suicide or something, a medical intervention to anything, right? That's just what immediately came to mind. So, that is definitely a potential privacy harm. And then also data, this has been trained on public data, which includes personal data in the EU's definition. So the EU under GDPR doesn't exclude publicly available data from being personal if it's attached to an identity. And if somebody says, I'd like to have that data deleted, you've already trained the model. What do you do? Is this an unethical use of training algorithms? Is this something like an FTCs and regulators might say, as a punishment, since it's almost like fruit of a poisonous tree, you didn't ask permission and you don't have any of the protections in place for, the inputs and the outputs. And from a privacy perspective, should we disgorge any of the profits and make you throw out the model that you trained? It'll be interesting to see what regulators decide to do and how much harm they determine is being caused by the lack of thinking of privacy by design here.
That's right. And I think it's also, if we start thinking about the public data set that it's been built on, and again, I'm not an expert here. I haven't seen the data set that it's actually been built on. But if we think about public sources, and I know some of the sources that they've gone through, I mean, let's start from the very basics. Like, what type of public content do we have online? A lot of this data and a lot of the data that these previous generative AIs have been built on, I mean, it's been pretty toxic, to be completely honest. So this is also where you're absolutely right that there's some really tricky decisions that if somebody wants to have something deleted and it's already ended up in training the model, then how do you trace something like that? Like, does the entire model get thrown out? But then there's also other things that most of the internet, I mean, there's a reason why a lot of regulators and a lot of folks in leadership positions are saying that, hey, it's not healthy to have our kids on social media or on the public internet, before they're a certain age, that before they can actually understand that. Well, on the flip side, is it then essentially okay to train a model based on that if we're not letting our kids onto that thing? So these are very, very tricky things. I'm optimistic because the OpenAI team and company, I mean, they have fantastic amount of brain power and they've spent a lot of time working on these things. So I'm, optimistic that these are a lot of things that they've been going through and that they've thought about. But there are some very serious things that you do have to think about because the internet itself, it's a big place and there's a lot of data sets. And it's not like there's this saying that, the data that you put in, that it equals the value that you get out, or, if you have garbage in, then you get garbage out. And it's not as linear in that sense. You can do a lot of things with the actual model itself. But that said, it is a concern because what you're training the model with, then general information is great. That's where you can get a broad view. But I think it also calls into this question that could, for example, we at Prifina plug in personal data sets into this? Now, the biggest thing is that, of course, your personal data set, it should stay personal to you. It shouldn't be shared across the population. But the idea that could all of us ourselves have our own personal AIs in a way, that's a really, really interesting thing that we see. It's also something that we've been working on for a long time now, that when we essentially look at the evolution of the internet, then we think it's obvious that we'll need to have our own personal assistants, so to speak, but they should be trained on our data. They should be trained on it privately, and they should be trained on it in a way that they actually end up representing us. But that's very hard to do. So that's also something where I think it'll take a while before we get there, because even if you can complement the data with your own personal data and you can come up with some type of a private personal AI, then getting to a general language model, I mean, that's a long way. Like my personal AI might be able to answer that, what type of shoe should I buy next? And that would already be fantastic. But for it to actually give me life advice, then I think we're a little bit away from that still today.
I love the personal AI concept, especially within the context of a platform that already has guardrails built in. So it seems like you could do a lot less damage because you're putting those guardrails in. Do you have any advice to data scientists and researchers and developers regarding, how to architect for ethical uses of LLMs? Can we ever make technology like ChatGPT, mostly safe? And I'm not including the personally trained AIs here, more of like this publicly trained, large, obviously LLM, I guess, can't be trained on a personal AI. It has to be a large data set by definition.
Yeah, and I think it's like your addition of like mostly safe. I think that's really where we need to get to, that nothing is going to be perfectly safe, unfortunately. So the realization is that I think education in general, and this is not necessarily just the data scientists and the technical community, but just everybody by at large that's using ChatGPT, which is basically everybody now. So it's also like an understanding of what it is. And then I think it's also like for a lot of people that are working with it, then I really like these vertical use cases that really focusing on very specific things. Like, for example, I mentioned that an AI-based shoe assistant. So I'm a runner, and for me, I switch shoes every 3-4 months. And if essentially I switch a shoe, then I mean, obviously the personal assistant, it can recommend that, it knows what my shoe size is and what type of shoes I've gone through and so on and so forth. But you could even monitor that, how does my stride and my walking and, so this is, like you said, that was the exclusion that you gave me, and I broke that one. But on the personal AI, I think it's really, really interesting to find those. But even on the large language models, then testing them for vertical examples. Like, for example, looking at that, like if somebody is treating the personal assistant as, a life coach or, a dietitian or whatever, then, I mean, we need to do a lot of research in terms of what is it actually doing. And they've done a lot of restrictions into the model itself, where it actually will tell you that this is off limits, that I'm not going here. But at the same time, I mean, there are so many of them. So that's essentially one of those areas where we need to have different vertical focus. And because many folks, they come into looking at large language models from a specific field or a specific use case or a specific interest, then I think we just need to have more of that exploration. This is completely natural, by the way, that when you have a big boom, especially big attention coming into something like this, it's completely natural that there's an education gap that we need to essentially catch up, and that we also need to experiment. So I think this is one of those areas where I'm quite optimistic that with the amount of attention that has gone into this, then there will be a lot more attention and critical attention, both from individuals, but also then from, like you mentioned, regulators and different agencies. But I think especially for individuals, then just reading up on it yourself and just understanding what it is, I think it's really, really fascinating, but I think it's also really important.
I totally agree with you. I guess the challenge that I have is I'm less optimistic that we'll have ethical guardrails from, regulators and laws in place and, rules and all of that, even standards, for a long time. I mean, it takes time. This is so new. It felt like it had just exploded onto the scene. And it's going to take time to get the general consensus from, a cross section of experts to get that stuff agreed upon. And so my concern is, who educates the general public. We have not seen great history of education across platforms. If anything, I've seen platform, like I'm just using like, I don't know, cloud as an example. Where's the cloud privacy stuff? Where I don't know who's trains on cloud privacy. It's just all security. What about like mobile apps and the app store and the different ways of doing that? I mean, it took many, many years before there were even like some of the rules around how to do that safely, and different methods that were taken by, an example, like Android is completely different app store philosophy, even forget about, how it's architected, the Play Store versus the Apple's App Store. And so when it came to ads, like nobody wanted to decide who had liability for stuff around the ads and what people see. And so what I'm concerned about is no one's going to take ownership on needs to integrate the ethics. Is it OpenAI needs to, has the moral responsibility to train people and educate those using their model? Is it the companies using that model who it's their job to educate downstream? I am not optimistic. Because the reason I do this work and trying to shift left is we haven't had people investing their money in privacy, in innovation. It was all focused on just compliance, governance, risk, compliance, legal, instead of architecting privacy by design and default into platforms and services to begin with. So just given that like rant I just went on, do you have a perspective?
I do. I mean, I'm with you. Nothing happens just by wishing for it to happen. I think one of the opportunities that I see is we've been really great at passing the buck down to the individual and just burdening the individual with a bunch of this stuff. Even the GDPR is like all the pop-ups and so on and so forth, disclaimers in terms of service and whatnot. I think we have to be very real and just realize that people don't read any of that. They just click them away the quickest they can, and they don't even know which button they're clicking. I don't like that we're essentially passing all this to the individual. But one thing that I see as an opportunity is that if you start, for example, from the very basics, that how many apps do all of us have on our phones? How many user accounts? How many sets of preferences? How many different data sets do we have across all the different things? One of the things that we like at Prifina is that if we can actually give you almost like your own super app into all your data, just one that you have that can then essentially manage all of these so that they don't get outdated. And then guess what? Like you said, it comes down at the architectural level that it's just under your control and your ownership. I really like this opportunity that maybe we can kind of create a simplified choice for the individual. That either you use it this way, where you're disclosing God knows what to God knows whom, or then you're using it this way where you essentially keep it and you get to choose. I think that's one of the things that I'm quite optimistic about in terms of the opportunity. Like, I don't know what probability I would put on it, but in Silicon Valley and just across the world, we've had a lot of focus on enterprise over the last 20 years. But I'm quite excited about the fact that could data be one where we can actually really create a consumer market? And it seems like a completely outlandish thing to propose because data has been so enterprise driven and it's been enterprises using this data. But if you look at, for example, all the attention that is going into personal data, like how much people are talking about, like regulators, policymakers are talking about, for example, in the EU, about how much data we have. I mean, they're already educating a lot of populations about the data that they've actually got. So if we can really take that and turn into a choice, that how can you use that? How can you actually make something beneficial to you? That's the analogy from like the personal data. And I think on large language models and generative AI in general, that if we can bring that in, those guardrails into some of these things at the ground floor, I mean, I think it has to be the developers and the companies that essentially introduces that for their individual customers, individual users. I'm like you, I'm very skeptical on like, the top down. I mean, if that does happen, that's going to take forever and it's just not going to be quick enough. But I think especially with the generative AI, I mean, it's such a hot area that we really do need something to happen there before they can go mainstream. Like it is OpenAI's ChatGPT is still in beta. So one open question is that what does it take for actually it to go from beta to essentially mass market? Like, at what stage do they stop calling it beta?
Yeah, I agree. And I want to say that normally I would continue to be pessimistic after this conversation that the ethical obligations and training would be on purpose by OpenAI or other organizations that are in this space, even downstream from them, that they don't want to take on the burden, right? Even if they have that sweet, sweet VC money and lots of it. But I guess I am reevaluating that because Microsoft has put so much money behind ChatGPT, and Microsoft has had one of the best reputations of staffing privacy experts because they had some early snafus maybe like 20 years ago, back when privacy law was really starting to begin being enforced. As a result, they added a lot of privacy expertise and have continued to do so over the years. So I'm hoping that there are people there that kind of help the organization move that needle, because we do pass the buck on to individuals. We have been doing that for years. This is the entire reason that consumers generally feel powerless. They just don't have the ability individually to make change, to feel like they can trust where their data is going, that they truly have choices about what's collected about them and how it's used. And that's just going to happen all over again, but to a deeper embedded degree that we can't undo. So with that, I want to ask you one last question before we conclude. And that's, what are you working on right now? What are you trying to solve? And do you have any sort of calls to action to the community?
So we have anybody listening that has, a fantastic thing that they'd like to put a sensor on and geek out over, then I'm always very, very happy to chat. But then also equally that a lot of what we're doing is taking these sensors and we're reimagining that data in an experience. So that's something where, if we've got something that, we could reimagine in terms of what it means to essentially buy a pair of shoes, like where do they come from, or just also like this example of the motorsport sensor in a helmet, for example, then those are conversations that I absolutely love. And those are also such that we're going to be taking to market here in 2023, step by step, and releasing more of those. So we have an open community that anybody can, they can join, they can hack around with different types of data sets and create really cool stuff. And that's fantastic. That's something that we really love to see. But then also you can expect to see some really cool collaborations that we have coming up here, where we're hopefully pushing the boundaries a little bit with new types of data sets, and also that personal value from different types of sensors that we just haven't had yet before.
That is just wonderful. So I encourage everyone to, join the community for Prifina. Is that in a Slack or?
Yeah, we have this, we call the community, we have this umbrella term for the community, which is liberty, equality, data. And it's one that we really like for the tone that it sets, that it's something where, we're all working towards something greater. But you can find all of this from Prifina.com. And then, you can find me on our Slack as well. So I'm always happy to kind of chat and geek out, especially as it comes to questions around data.
Well, I love that you really make your values front and center, even in the name of the community group. Well, Markus, thank you for joining us today on Shifting Privacy Left to discuss Prifina's approach to building privacy-respective apps for consumer wearable sensors, LLMs, models like ChatGPT, and why we should consider training personal AIs.
No, thank you, Deborah.
Sure thing. Thanks for joining us today, everyone. Until next Tuesday, when we'll be back with engaging content and another great guest. Thanks for joining us this week on Shifting Privacy Left. Make sure to visit our website, shiftingprivacyleft.com, where you can subscribe to updates so you'll never miss a show. While you're at it, if you found this episode valuable, go ahead and share it with a friend. And if you're an engineer who cares passionately about privacy, check out Privado, the developer-friendly privacy platform and sponsor of this show. To learn more, go to privado.ai. Be sure to tune in next Tuesday for a new episode. Bye for now.